Hi, I'm James Turner and I'm an advisor with IBRS. Today I'm joined by my colleague Dr. Joseph Sweeney. Joe's been doing dozens and dozens of interviews over quite a period of time, and I'll get him to talk more about his research. But IBRS, we're a firm dedicated to research and advisory for the local IT community, and we're interested in helping organisations do responsible and sustainable use of technology to support business outcomes. Joe, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Awesome. So I'm not even going to try and describe your research, but I'm looking forward to you talking through it. So towards workforce of the future, let's get into it. Start talking to me. How did you come about doing this?
Well, I've been involved with fairly large-scale end-user compute strategies and mobility and so forth for over a decade now. And what we've been seeing is that over this period of time, the focus has gone through a wave of, how do we modernize the desktop, and then how do we embrace mobility? And now the wave started to move to combining all of those things together to create this new concept. Some people call it a digital workspace, whatever you want to call that. But the real issue underpinning all of this is workforce transformation. Now, we do know from many other sources that jobs are going to change in the future. There's going to be a lot more automation. There's going to be a lot more AI. That means that the investments we're making now need to be prepared for that future workforce. And it's a bit of a catch-22. They're going to enable it, but we have to be prepared for them now. And we don't know what that future workforce actually looks like. That's why Dell engaged me to look into this issue with them. So thank you to Dell for sponsoring that. And we interviewed well over 100 very senior executives, CIOs, CDOs, CTOs, to find out what they were doing and what their challenges were and how they were trying to work around those. And we got them into a lot of groups where they would share their ideas and challenge each other. And then I took copious notes from that and started to come up with some frameworks.
Fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward to going through this with you. So, let's get into it. So
Great.
I'll move on to the first slide, and obviously just remind me when you need me to move. The thorny issue of workforce innovation.
Yeah, the biggest challenge in all of this is that there's very different expectations about what innovation is and what it means. Because if you're going to be talking about transforming or creating an innovative workforce, you need to understand what innovation actually is. What we do know is what it's not. It's not something you can just pick up and buy. You can't have a bunch of consultants, no matter how good they are, like us, we're great, but you can't have them come in and tell you how to do innovation. The reason for this is that innovation, certainly when it relates to the workforce, actually must be based on the characteristics of that workforce, what they're doing right at the coalface, where they're doing it, and the time that they're doing it. So innovation takes on very different approaches for different organizations. Now, technology can certainly help you. It can enable new types of innovation. It can enable new processes and new ways of thinking. But what it will not do is perform innovation for you. That has to be done within your organization.
So sadly, I can't go to a software vendor and order some SKUs of innovation.
You can absolutely do that. I'm sure that there'll be plenty of vendors who will sell you innovation. What they won't do is actually enable you to perform innovation. So one of the things that, when we started discussing this problem of innovation, one of the things that we began to look at is what is the role within the organization that IT needs to plug in with most closely. Now, during the 90s and even the noughties, many CIOs were talking about having to be very close to finance. They had to understand the finance of the business. And that made sense for the type of computing that was possible at that time, the type of processes that could be automated. But what we're now finding with the very real and tangible changes coming into the workforce is that is shifting over to human resources. And there were some fantastic discussions around how does the CIO make sure that the IT group fully understands what these workforce changes coming along the lines are. And that means that they need to sit right next to the HR group. But likewise, and I think even more importantly, what we started to see was that where the IT team has embedded itself into HR and really become a trusted ally of HR, those are the organizations that were able to really think or rethink what their workforce did, where they did it, how they did it, when they did it, and see some deep, not just innovation around the edge, but real deep structural transformation inside the businesses, all the way down to changing how they hired people.
That's fascinating, and I'm certainly seeing some parallels within the space that I research in security. Because your traditional people that led cybersecurity, or IT security, as we used to call it, came from that technology background. But now that they're executives and that's all things cyber, the people side of things is incredibly important. And that quote that you've got there from a CIO, I think, really captures it nicely.
Yeah, it was one of my favorite, absolutely one of my favorite quotes from the whole series, because it was one of the key enablers. Interestingly, one of the key hindrances of this is, in fact, our approaches to funding end-user compute and the risk-adverse nature of it. So procurement, the old financial models that we used to really protect, are now a liability to us.
And I'm reminded of that quote, someone that knows the value of, what was it, the cost of everything and the value of nothing. So it's not a generational thing, it's a survival instinct.
Yes. So one of the things that we looked at is, and it always comes up, when we talk about innovation and workforce innovation using all the new digital tools, there was a lot of, or in fact, the vast majority of the organizations were saying, we try that, but our staff don't want to move. And when we started pulling it apart and saying, okay, which staff don't want to move? Because clearly there is an appetite for innovation. Certainly you hear that from the board level. You hear that from line of business managers quite often. But why do we not get people really looking at their jobs and the tools that they now have, the Office 365s and the new mobility and all these other, the Googles and all this other great stuff that they've got, and not applying it to their work environment? And what we started to see was a really interesting pattern. It took us many, many, many interviews to find this. But it was not related to the old, it's Gen Y versus baby boomers. It's not that at all. What it actually is it seems to be length of tenure. And if you are, say, 40 years old, 45 years old, and you look at a new opportunity to change your job fundamentally, to bring in new processes because of new tech, you're going to resist that, because there's a very real chance that you might find yourself unskilled for that environment. And there is an ageism in Australia, in fact, throughout the Western world, that makes that absolutely terrifying. So when we started to look at the psychology of this, the workforce psychology, it was pretty clear that this was related to tenure. Interestingly, people who are in the last, say, 5-7 years of their career, they love this because they want to leave a legacy. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but it seems to be very, very common. Likewise, the new recruits coming into the organization, they're just full of ideas, not because they're young and Gen Y and hip, but because they don't carry the baggage of how it is done. And also, increasingly, they don't fear having to switch between jobs. Certainly in the last 10 years, people moving into the workforce absolutely have the expectation that they're going to switch between careers many times, at least 3 or 4 times. So it's this interesting middle gap of tenure, of 10, 15 years tenure, that's really getting in the way. They're the people who you've got to get on side, and that's hard work.
Interesting. So there's that thing of I'm not quite yet at the point where I'm interested in being the mentor and the legacy leaver, but I don't feel sufficiently nailed to the floor that I can't be flexible.
Exactly. And out of the, I think it was about 115 odd organizations that we actually interviewed, there was only 3 organizations that really nailed this problem. And all of them used very formal approaches to embedding innovation culture, if you will. One of the very successful ones of those was to use what they call nests, where the people who are coming into the organization 6 months after they had been hired in, no matter their age, but they just had to be new to the organization, they were formally interviewed saying, what can we do better? Or what about our company makes you crazy? And then those ideas would be then put into a small sprint where they would see if they could solve that craziness. Great method, very, very easy to execute. Relatively inexpensive. This does not require a big innovation team. What it requires is bringing the existing talent together in such a way that they can experiment and that they're happy to look at their organization and the processes and say, that's broken, or that could be done differently, or this is new, should we try this? And have a comfortable place where they can try those things and experiment.
User convenience and business alignment, that's crazy talk.
Yes, which is why only 3 of the 115 odd organizations actually got that into place. And by the way, I'm not trivializing this. Those 3 organizations that really nailed it well, 2 of them took 3 years to embed it. That's the time that it actually took that process just to become part of the way of doing business, and the other one took 5 years. So this is not a trivial activity, and it requires a great deal of support, but what it doesn't require is a huge amount of money.
But it would take quite a lot of political will to keep it going after that period of time.
It requires, well, once you've got it going, these things have a life of their own. They actually become part of the organization. And people love to work in an organization where they're recognized for making things better. It's all about mastery at this stage. The challenge is that's scary for this group, this very large group that we've got of tenure. And that's going to remain that way for at least the next decade and a half.
Fascinating. Okay, well, let's change on the next slide. So, is IT standardization the enemy? And there's a great quote there.
Yes. So we then looked at, once we got past that innovation discussion and the cultural discussion that we're all very aware of, we then started saying, okay, what are the workplace tools that we give people? The mobile devices, the desktops, the laptops, the hybrid, whatever that looks like. Increasingly, it will be wearables and AI and so forth. What is the impact of that on the organizations? And interestingly, what kept on coming up is the requirement of IT, or at least the way that many IT departments see themselves, is to standardize delivery of IT so it's easy to support, it's economical and secure and all the other good stuff. That is important. But what happens is that it means that every job is treated pretty much the same way. But what we know is going to happen in the future, with a much greater casualization of the workforce and much more use of contracted labor and so forth, those standardized approaches just simply will no longer work. We need to move into a very much an as-a-service model where the focus is not on the device, it's not even on the technology per se. The technology is just a window, an endpoint, a node in a series of work processes and functions. And they will be performed increasingly by a loose affiliation of workers who are very heavily empowered to make decisions and get things done. So you can see that the whole idea of standardizing the desktop environment is an anathema to where the future will be. And many, in fact, interestingly, more than half of the people that we spoke to said, that's already happened, that's gone. IT just hasn't caught up to it yet. But we have to get past this standardized approach.
Amazing, isn't it? IT was meant to be bringing in new technology to enable businesses, but now it's actually become the Department of Legacy.
Yeah, and part of that, I will have to caution that there's very sound reasons why we are the Department of Legacy. A lot of it has to do with procurement and risk adversity, but at the same time, the technology, the ability for the technology to self-heal or to be very robust in a consumer sense has really changed the game.
Very interesting. Okay, next slide. Talk to me about the journey ahead.
Well, look, most people probably are down on the SOE end of things. That is the standard operating environment. That's highly standardized environment. And that stood the test. I mean, that's a 30-year-old model, which has been really, really solid. And if we moved up the line a little bit and we tried to use, a lot more of the more automated approaches to delivering the desktops and to some extent mobility, we might have a managed operating environment. But what we do see in the near term, and by near term I'm talking 3 to 5 years, is that we'll move into this concept of what we call digital workspaces, which is much more of a self-service delivery model. And this means that a worker they might just be starting that day. They might only be in the office or in the employment maybe a partial amount of time, but they can come with their own devices or a device which has been given to them, doesn't matter, and they can say, this is my identity, and the systems will know what they should have access to, and then they can request other things. So it's very much it's sort of like it is a consumer approach. It's very much the App Store approach, but across all devices, but specific to what that organization needs to get done and what sort of worker they need to do that job. Now, if you do that well, you then have a series of very flexible tools and an environment, a framework where you can enable workforce innovation, because now people can start experimenting and changing how they do things. And if there's a feedback loop where that's enabled, you do get workforce innovation, eventually leading to what we call workforce transformation, which is these big scary headlines about mass changes of the jobs. Now, this is coming, That workforce transformation is coming. It's either coming to you or it's coming to one of your competitors. Hopefully it's coming to you first so that you can deal with it. But you won't be able to deal with that without first looking at this digital workspaces issue. So my strong advice that certainly we took from the CTOs and the CIOs was focus on getting the platform for digital workspaces. Get it in now. It's going to take your IT teams at least a couple of years to get their heads around what this actually means. And at that point, you now have a lot of flexibility and a lot more resilience given what's coming around the corner in employment.
Wow, okay, that's a lot to digest.
Well, you can download the infographic. We also, I'll do a little bit of spruik here. We did produce a lovely summary document from the roundtables, and it is a very, very high level. I'm more than happy to talk to other people in more detail about this. But we did develop a range of formal frameworks from this research. And I believe I've got another video coming up where we will talk about those frameworks.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I can just look at that infographic and I can see that there's a lot of depth there behind all of the ideas and the way that you've arranged things. The better the infographic, the more you can tell what's gone into. In terms of like a single next step that you'd be advising CIOs to be thinking about or taking on next, what would that be if there was one thing?
I don't think there is one thing. I think it's, as I said, it's a perfect storm.
Nice answer.
Well, the first thing I really think is that they need to figure out that they are not responsible for business transformation or disruption. That is something which is a business issue. Now, they can advise on it, but it is fundamentally something which is outside of IT's control. However, IT is absolutely in the perfect nexus to drive innovation at the coalface of the business, which is what gives you this idea of the workforce innovation leading to transformation. So we need to be very heavily involved in HR. We need to understand what the hiring patterns are going to look like. We need to advise those groups about what is possible for employment. And then, and this is the hard part, we need to step back, look at our own assumptions, and I'll deal with this in a later video. Look at our own assumptions that exist within IT and restructure IT to support the innovation which needs to happen.